And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a bright, sunny Winnipeg afternoon, the kind of day that I would really enjoy getting out and walking. One of the things that happened when the pandemic was declared is that I started working at home. I previously had worked at the University of Manitoba. I'm still working there, but everything that I do is online. So I've basically set up a little studio for myself in my basement, and this is where I've been working for about the last year. But I also realized that I would need to get some exercise because sitting in a chair for hours at a time, to my mind, was not a good recipe for health. And my wife was always a very avid walker. And so I thought, well, why don't I join her on her walks? And so that was my thought when this whole thing first began, was that I should join my wife in some of her walks. So this is actually a picture. In fact, I started out the title slide here with a picture of my wife. Yes, that's her, and I'm under all that bundling in her parka. And we have managed to walk for much of this winter, throughout the winter. And I have to say that I think this was made possible by the remarkably warm winter we've had. And I realize the last couple of weeks haven't been quite so nice, but it's been pretty remarkable otherwise. And I think our walking has been definitely benefited because of it, because I have to admit, I am a bit of a good weather walker. I don't like going out when it's like -30. So we've been enjoying the wonderful weather and therefore seeing a lot of things. And I guess I'll just tell you why I first got interested in doing this. I live in Charleswood, and this is a picture looking down my street. As you can see, it's sort of a more rural part of Winnipeg. I don't have a lot of neighbors, and the street is ramrod straight for about 2 miles. Eventually, at the end of 2 miles, there's another major road. And so my wife and I were just basically walking up and down the road. And I have to say that after about the 30th time, I was getting pretty bored, because I want to see things. I mean, I want to experience history. I want to see architecture. I wanted to just see something different. I was getting just bored with the same old scenery. So I suggested to my wife that instead of just walking up and down our street, why wouldn't we just drive somewhere and get out, park our car, and walk there? And so she took my idea, and we have run with it literally for the last several months. Here's a map of Winnipeg. The red dot shows where we live. So I say we're kind of on the outskirts of the city. But because we're interested in history and because we're interested in architecture, we have been venturing pretty much around the entire city in the course of our travels. And I can't really show you the entire areas that we've walked because, to be honest, I've had a few technical problems trying to work out where exactly all places I walked. But I am going to show you a lot of pictures today of the places that we've been. And just to give you an idea of just the scope of our walking, the blue dots represent the places where I'm going to show you a picture today. So I've been to largely part of the city, and this isn't all of it because this is only the pictures I'm showing you today. There's a lot of other places that we have been that I'm not going to show you any pictures for. So I have been taking lots of photos along my way, and I'm partly it was because I was just fascinated by things that I was seeing. And I guess maybe in the back of my mind, I thought perhaps that someday I might have an opportunity to tell people about some of the things that I had seen. So I didn't anticipate, I suppose, just how soon that would be. But I wanted to just put in a plug too, that when I was out taking pictures, I suppose I could have taken my camera. This is the camera that I use. It's a Nikon D750. It's a fabulous camera. It takes great photos. But, I just didn't want to take it with me. The reason, I suppose, is mainly that it's bulky and I didn't want to have that hanging around my neck. Of course, it's often cold and I wasn't sure how well it would work in the cold temperatures. And there was times when I was in areas of the city that, frankly, I just didn't want to have an expensive piece of equipment hanging around my neck. It would just be something a little more inconspicuous that would be desirable. And maybe you've heard this expression, that the best camera is the one you're carrying. So, you might say, well, I've got a better camera at home, but the bottom line is if you've got a cell phone nowadays, especially the modern cell phones are remarkably good at taking photos. So in fact, all of the photos I'm going to show you this afternoon were taken with my cell phone. And there is a very distinct advantage, I have to say, too, to using a cell phone to take pictures, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. This is one of the scenes that I have seen in the course of our travels, and I have to say one of the most fascinating parts of the walk for me was to walk along the rivers. This is an area along the Red River, actually not far from the University of Manitoba. And a few weeks ago, my wife and I walked along the river. What you can see here is, among other things, the low water levels that we have right now. Man, the rivers are low. And that's shown by the fact that a lot of times where we were walking was not on the river itself, but on the exposed mud on the bottom of the river, particularly around the edges. So the trail that you see here in this photo, it's actually on mud. It's not on ice at all. You have to walk a little ways off to the right to get onto the river itself. And, I wasn't always crazy about walking on the surface of the ice, mainly because we have had such a mild winter that there are places where we saw open water. In fact, quite frequently over the winter, throughout the winter, we have seen patches of open water. And I just wasn't keen on the idea of falling through the ice and getting into trouble with that. So more often than not, we would walk along the edges of the rivers. But it gives you a unique perspective, because unless you're a boater, and I'm not, you don't get to see a lot of the views that you can see walking along the rivers. So I heartily recommend getting out and walking the rivers, particularly the Assiniboine River, because the Assiniboine is well, and as I'll show you in a moment, has lots of stuff on it that you can see that is, I think, very interesting. And it's also, we found anyway, there weren't as many places where there was open water. There were a few, but not as many, it seemed. So here's a scene along the Assiniboine River. And of course, not surprisingly, there were gathering places that, used the appropriate social distancing. I just love this example. You get these high-rise apartments in the background, and then there's these chairs set out. And we found chairs all over the place, presumably people who felt, that it would be nice to have a place for people to stop as they're walking along the river, stop and have a rest. There was a lot of community spirit that we saw in the various places we walked. There was lots of other things. There was community art. This is a scene near the Forks, some of the public art that's on display there. The Winnipeg Foundation, in celebration of its 100th anniversary, contributed to the development of a wonderful walking and skating trail along the Assiniboine from the Forks westward. Heartily recommend it. And, frankly, one of the best places that we found walking along the Assiniboine was in the area of Wolseley. In fact, if there was ever a prize given out to the creativity of Winnipeg neighborhoods during the pandemic, my vote would go to the people in Wolseley. They just went over the top, with, well, you can see here, ice sculptures and Christmas trees and warming areas where they'd have a little fire going and chairs. And, it was just really impressive, the things that they did to make people feel welcome. And over the course of the last several months, my wife and I have walked from the Forks all the way along the Assiniboine. We didn't do it in one single day. We did it in stretches, but we walked all the way from the Forks out past the Perimeter Highway into Headingley along the Assiniboine River. And it's wonderful. I would heartily recommend a walk along the Assiniboine. The Seine, too. We've walked along the Seine River for part of it as well. Because the water levels are low, you can see things that you might not see in a normal year. So, for example, we were walking along the Red River, not far from the Elm Park Bridge, and we saw these, and we were wondering about what they were. They were a bunch of posts in a nice, neat row, and there was a local resident nearby, and he said, "Oh, that's the former pier of the Winnipeg Canoe Club." And I said, "Well, that can't be, because the canoe club's on the other side of the river, around the bend from where this is." He said, "No, this is the original site of the Winnipeg Canoe Club before it moved to the site on the other side of the river." And I thought, "Oh, that's interesting." That would mean that it's probably somewhere around 1910 or so that this pier dates to. But we saw all sorts of things in the course of our walks along the river. We saw actually quite a lot of ice sports. So, for example, we saw a number of milk jug curling rinks, basically where they took one of those plastic milk jugs and filled it with water and froze it solid. and then created a curling rink, and then slid the milk jugs along and played curling on the ice surface. Of course, skating, oh yeah, lots of that. And hockey. We saw, a lot of kids just playing, impromptu on the hockey rinks. There was even a guy, and I just have to show you this picture. There was a guy out west of the perimeter on the Assiniboine. Not only had he created a little hockey rink for himself, he put up lights, as you can see here. There's these light standards at each corner of the rink. But even better, he had his own homemade Zamboni. Yeah, he had made it out of a dishwasher, and he towed it around behind his gardening tractor, and he had a little heater on it to keep the water from freezing as he dribbled it onto the surface of the ice. And he went around and round and round and made the ice nice and smooth and shiny. And so I thought, well, that's really somebody going to great lengths to enable hockey to play on the Assiniboine. And here's another view of the Assiniboine. This is actually just a little bit west of the bridge across the Assiniboine in Headingley. The rural municipality of Headingley actually created, I think, a wonderful skating and walking trail by plowing the Assiniboine. Real, kudos to the municipality. It is really a great stretch of ice. In fact, I have this recurring idea, and I would love to see it happen. I don't know how I would get it to happen, but my idea is, wouldn't it be really cool to get the Winnipeg Jets to skate down the river, down on one of these exposed skating trails? Wouldn't that be that's so neat to see the Jets out skating on the river? I wish I knew somebody that I could call and say, hey, you should get that to happen. I think that'd be a great visual. Another thing I've discovered in the course of walking along the river is you get a unique perspective on things you've taken for granted. So this is the Maryland Bridge, right next to the Misericordia Hospital in the background. And I have walked across this bridge. I have biked across this bridge. I have driven across this bridge more times than I can remember. And yet I wouldn't have recognized it from this perspective, seeing it from below. And I have a lot of appreciation, a lot of respect for engineering. I have friends, I have relatives who are engineers. And looking at the understructure, I'm always amazed at, what it takes to build a bridge. And I'm always, comparing one bridge to another. Now that I know a little bit more about bridge engineering, I can get a lot of insight into, how things work. So for example, going back to that Elm Park Bridge that I mentioned before, by the way, it's also the BDI Bridge. If you're used to going to the Bridge Drive-In for ice cream, it's the bridge right next to it. It's a very nice, what's called in engineering terms, a through truss bridge built in 1913. Here it is from looking from below. Excuse me. One of the things you can discover looking from below is that it actually has a pivot. The bridge is designed to turn 90 degrees. And of course, the idea was at one time there were ships running up and down the Red River. They would have had to have that ability to pivot the bridge. And of course, the mechanism hasn't pivoted in decades. Probably it may never have pivoted for all we know, but the mechanism is still there and you can see it when you look from underneath. So something that wouldn't be visible from the top, and that's most of what we see when we're crossing that bridge. The other thing you can see underneath the bridges is, of course, graffiti. And some of it is pretty awful, of course, but some of it is really quite impressive. This is actually under the bridge at the Perimeter Highway on the Assiniboine. And boy, whoever put their work into this really was clever. They're really, I think, a talented artist. And I would have never seen this had we walked along the bridge at top. The only way to see it would be to walk under the bridge. Unfortunately, there were sometimes, shall we say, less fortunate things we saw walking underneath the bridge. So, for example, walking under the Osborne Bridge near Osborne Village, we actually saw somebody's impromptu residence. There was somebody living under the bridge, and it's not great to think about, especially in the winter, well, really any time that somebody would be homeless. But the fact that they would have to live outside in this weather is pretty sobering. So we saw a little bit of that as well. If you walk up out of the river valleys, and even just on the river banks, there's some interesting stuff. So one of the places we walked was in Whittier Park in St. Boniface. And I was amazed. I'm a biologist by training. That's my professional ability. And I was amazed at the size of some of the trees we saw along the river in Whittier Park. here I am. Well, I labeled myself a tree hugger. I guess that's technically what I am doing here in this photo, hugging one of the mammoth cottonwoods that we saw. And like, it's absolutely enormous. You know, as you can see, I can't even put my arms even around a fraction of it. I have never seen such huge cottonwoods as I saw along that walk along the Red River. I would submit to you that this is Manitoba's answer to the Cathedral Grove of redwood trees in British Columbia. And if you've ever been to the Cathedral Grove on Vancouver Island, you know there's some pretty darn big trees there. Well, you know, I don't know everybody has seen the big cottonwoods we have in Manitoba, but there's some pretty good size ones that you can go and see. Well, we move out of the river valleys and onto the streets, and this is where I'll spend the rest of my presentation. You know, I walked so many streets and saw so many buildings, and I'm fascinated by it all. I mean, as anybody who's listened to my radio program knows, I am fascinated by all sorts of things. And one of the things that fascinates me are buildings. And I'll say more about this building a little bit later. But for the time being, what I wanted to say is one of the beauties of using a cell phone camera is that it also attaches additional information. So this picture I took with my cell phone, and then I brought it back and loaded it into my computer, and I opened it in a program. Now, the particular program I use is called OrphanView. Not that there's anything special about it. It's just one of the many things that you can use to view photos on a computer. But when you open OrphanView on this photo, it gives you some details about the photo. It tells you how big it is, for example, when you took the picture and things like that. You can also push, there's a button there labeled XF information. And basically what that means is there's additional information that the camera records at the time it took a picture. And if you press that button, XF info, it will open another window, this one right here. And if you scroll down, it gives you all sorts of information about the conditions of the camera when you took the picture. But most importantly for me, it gives the latitude and longitude where the picture was taken. You can see I've circled it with that yellow oval. That's the latitude and longitude of the picture. So the nice thing then is you can load up something like Google Maps or Apple Maps or any of the other mapping software on your computer. You can type this information into it, and it'll put a point in the map saying this is where you took that picture. And you know, so many times I have looked at a picture I took and thought, where did I take that picture again? I don't remember. You know, I remember taking the picture, but I don't remember exactly where I was. Well, in the picture of a photo taken with a smartphone, assuming you have turned on this capability, and it should be normally turned on by default, your pictures taken with a cell phone have the location information embedded in them, which is wonderful because I was able to find out all kinds of things from the pictures that I had forgotten that I had taken and where I'd taken them. So let me just show you. This is one of the pictures that I took. It's on William Avenue down in downtown Winnipeg. It's a building called Victoria Court. You can see near the top of the building, there's a big plaque on the outside of the building giving its name. And I did a little bit of research about it because I was curious about it. As you can see from the picture, it's not being occupied. It's abandoned. In fact, it has been abandoned probably since about 2004. It sustained a fire inside, and I guess whoever owns it just hasn't seen fit to clean up the damage and to restore it. The building itself was built in 1910, and the architect for the building was a guy named Paul Clemens. He was an Icelander. He came to Winnipeg in 1898, and he worked with a group of fellow Icelanders who worked as contractors, craftsmen, laborers. In fact, interestingly enough, because they were all Icelandic, when they were working, they all worked in Icelandic. That was the working language of the job site. And they built piles of apartment blocks. This is an example of an apartment block built before the First World War. And this is something that fascinates me because, you know, the population of Winnipeg was exploding before the First World War. There were thousands of people arriving day by day. They needed a place to live. And the most efficient way to accommodate people was an apartment block. So they built hundreds of apartment blocks around the city before the First World War. And I was curious to know how many of those original pre-1930, I chose 1930 mainly because it was the period before the Great Depression. And I thought it'd be interesting just to see how many of these pre-1930 apartment blocks are still left. And the number is actually about 400. There's about 400 apartment blocks around Winnipeg that are pre-1930. And so I photographed piles of them. I'm not going to show you them all. There wouldn't be nearly enough time to show you all of the pre-1930 apartment blocks that I photographed. I'll just show you just a couple of specimens just to give you a general idea. Here's another one that was designed by Mr. Clemens in 1911, Diana Court. It looks different than the first one. This one was also boarded up for a while. But when I was here again this summer, or pardon me, this past winter, I noticed that it was open again. Somebody has obviously cleaned it up, and they're living in it again. So that's always nice to see. Unfortunately, there are others that are not so good looking. This is one not far north from Portage Avenue. It's on Quappel Avenue at the corner of Quappel and Carleton Street. And as near as I've been able to determine, it's been boarded up since either 2014 or 2015. In fact, the reason I can say that is that Google Street View is very good at providing photos in the past. So I found that in 2014, the windows weren't boarded up. In 2015, they were. So something happened, I guess, and it's been boarded up ever since. So too bad. It's a nice old building. It's called the Vermont Court, probably dating from the same sort of time as those previous two I've shown you. And as far as I know, it's still boarded up. Another one, but much smaller. I was fascinated by this little guy. It's a very small apartment block. In fact, well, looking at it, I would say there's probably no more than maybe pushing it 6 apartments in this building. But even then, they would be pretty tiny ones because the thickness of this building, well, you can see the entire thickness of the building there in this photo. I mean, it's barely the width of one room. So maybe it wouldn't even be 6. It might even be just 3, one on each floor. It too suffered a fire sometime after 2016. The building is called the Chessway Apartments. You can see there's a sign above the door there, Chessway. And you might be curious to know why it's called that. Well, it used to be at the corner of Chestnut Street. Well, there's the Chess from Chessway. And today it's on Honeyman Avenue, but it used to be this part of Honeyman used to be part of Broadway. So there's the way part. Chess from Chestnut and Way from Broadway at the corner of Chestnut and Broadway. Too bad again that it had a fire, but I'm hoping that somebody will see fit in the future to clean it up. But proof that not all of the old apartment blocks are run down and boarded up. Here's a really nice one in the Wolseley area. It's called the Rosalinda apartment block, built in 1913 by an architect named Peter Samuel. He was born in the Netherlands. He came to Manitoba in around 1910. He, like Paul Clemens, designed a whole lot of houses and apartment blocks. And then he, like Clemens, moved on. And so both of the men ended up in the United States. They both ended up continuing to work as architects in the US, but they both left a nice legacy of buildings of various kinds around Winnipeg. And so anybody who's interested in architecture can check out some of these buildings built by either Mr. Clemens or Mr. Samuel. Another very nice apartment block that I always admire when I go by it is the Ambassador Apartments, or at least that's how it was known when it was first built in 1909. It was designed by an architect named John Woodman in 1909, right at the corner of Hargrave there. And you can see that it is quite an unusual shape. It's triangular. Now, today, it's no longer called the Ambassador. It was renamed the Breadalbane block in 1928. And that's the name under which it's known today. It underwent a renovation a few years ago, and it's still in reasonably good condition. A very nice apartment block. Well, now let's come back to that picture I showed you just a little while ago and to say more about it. So I've shown you some apartment blocks, which of course are high density accommodation. Another means of accommodating many people in a smaller amount of space is a kind of building called a terrace. Terrace, that's a formal term in architecture for a building where you have several basically apartments side by side. In some places they might call them tenements. Of course, in New York City, they have the brownstones where you get a whole bunch of them side by side. Well, we do have things like that in Winnipeg, as well as other places. There is, for example, a really nice terrace in Virden. There's a nice terrace in Brandon. And there are a few terraces here in Winnipeg, not as many as there used to be, because a lot of the terraces have been demolished. But when we were walking along Arnold Avenue in the Lord Roberts neighborhood, we found this one. And I don't know very much about it yet, other than that it was built in 1914. And I found that statistic from the city of Winnipeg. Their tax assessment information tells me that it was built in 1914, but I don't yet know what architect designed it. I'm going to do some more digging on it, but I'm still fascinated by this sort of multi-family residence type of building. Here's another example of a terrace. This is one on Kennedy, a little bit more glamorous, a little bit probably more upscale. They're bigger for sure. And again, a multi-family residence this one was built in 1902. So terraces were pretty common around the turn of the 20th century, like apartment blocks, but they were intended probably for larger family groups. You know, an apartment was more for smaller families, maybe individual couples or even single people. Occasionally you'd get larger apartments as well, but these terraces were definitely for families. I'm also interested in other sorts of accommodation. So not long ago, my wife and I walked past the Vendome Hotel on Fort Street, just south of Portage Avenue. And one of the things I remember about the Vendome is that about 7 years ago, I went on a walking tour of downtown Winnipeg, and we stopped at the Vendome. We actually went in and had a lunch in its cafeteria. And I remember because it was a great burger I had, just a fabulous burger, one of the best I remember. And even this years later, I still remember that burger. The hotel itself is actually one of the older hotels in Winnipeg, built in 1898. It's gone through a few changes through the years. One of the ones that I'm most notable for is that the cornice near the top has been removed. Sometime between 2015 and 2016, they took off the cornice at the top there. You can still see the outline of it. You notice that in the middle, it kind of rose up a little bit and then across. It was quite attractive. And I'm anticipating they took it off because it was probably in poor repair and they were worried that it might detach on its own and fall to the ground, and that might be potentially dangerous. But of course, it's still in use today. It's what we sometimes call an SRO, a single room occupancy facility. Basically, where you have a room in the hotel, you might be there for months or years. Usually, they have relatively few amenities. They don't provide usually an in-suite bath, for example. You have to go down the hallway to use a communal bathroom for that kind of thing. But anyway, I'm fascinated by these old hotels, and the Vendome is one of the nicer ones. Another one of the things that my wife and I have been seeking in our walks are Safeway stores. Now, if you've ever been to a Safeway store, you probably remember that they tout the fact that they came to Winnipeg in 1929. In every store, they would have things saying, serving Winnipeg since 1929. Well, in 1929, they opened about a dozen Safeway stores, and they weren't like the ones we have today. They weren't the big stores that we have today. They weren't even the ones from the 50s that had that sort of swooping roof line. That was later. These original ones from 1929 were very modest by comparison. And they were actually in neighborhoods. So, you would find them right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It was almost like the small corner store. This is an example, in fact, of one that is still in use as a grocery store. It's not Safeway anymore. It hasn't been Safeway in many, many years on St. Matthews. It's one of the original Safeways built in 1929, and it has characteristic features that give it away. So if you look at this building, you'll see on the front of it, on each side, there is a sort of a brick pillar, and on the top of the pillar, there's a little sort of a decorative element. It kind of looks almost like a spire on a church, maybe, or a little sort of a fancy roof line. That's a dead giveaway. You see that, and there's a very good chance that it's an old Safeway. The other thing we look for is this sort of sculpted sort of awning at the top. Originally, I thought it was ceramic. I think now it's probably metal. And that too was very characteristic of the early Safeways. So you see those two things and immediately you go, okay, that's an old Safeway. And in the course of our travels around the city so far, we have found 17 of those original Safeways, and not a single one is a Safeway store. Most of them are still in use. Some of them are still grocery stores. Some of them are something else. And by the way, we've also found 6 former Safeways in rural towns as well. Various places around Manitoba that were large enough to warrant having a Safeway. And again, they all have this characteristic look. So when we were walking on Coppell, we saw this little grocery store, and immediately I went to my wife and said, "There's another Safeway." turns out, no, this isn't a former Safeway. It has many of the same decorative elements. It has those two brick columns on either side. Now, you'll notice there's no little decorative thing on top. So you could always say, well, maybe that was removed at some point. But it also has that awning, that metal awning. And I thought, that for sure gives it away. But it turns out, when I did some research on it, that this building was built earlier than 1929. It preceded the arrival of Safeway in Winnipeg. I have to wonder, maybe if Safeway didn't copy the architectural style of this building. As far as I know, it's the only one of its kind, pre-Safeway, and yet it looks so much like an old Safeway. Or we were walking in Wolseley, and we were walking along Arlington, and I saw this building, and I went, wow, another Safeway. And again, it has the two brick columns on either side. It has that metal awning on the front. I did some research, and no, this also is not a former Safeway. This one was built in 1922. And today it's somebody's home. It's been a various things in the past. Back when it was first built in 1922, it was a tailoring shop. Tailor, you'd go there to get your clothes hemmed or whatever else you needed to do from a tailor. What I find fascinating about it too is, if you look closely, you'll see that there's actually a stairs in the front yard leading down to the basement, right there in the front yard. And I can't imagine why they would have needed that, unless it was for bringing stuff into the basement. Maybe they were getting a delivery of something and it was just easier to go into the basement directly, perhaps. I don't know, but it was never a Safeway. So I thought that was kind of neat. Well, here's another example of a building that kind of looks vaguely like a Safeway. Again, the two columns on either side, the metal awning. But this is a telephone exchange building. This one actually is in Carberry, Manitoba. And there's several of them around the province that I found that look somewhat like this. In fact, any of you that live in River Heights may recognize a building that looks a lot like this on Niagara Street in River Heights. And it also is a telephone exchange building. Unlike this one in Carberry is no longer in use by the phone company. The one on Niagara is used still by MTS, or Bell MTS, as I guess it's called now. Speaking of telephones, when we were walking in St. Boniface along Horace Street, we saw this building. And of course, I see on the door, it still has the MTS logo. It, as far as I can tell, is still used by Bell MTS for phone service. But I know that it's an older building, because if you look at the top, the sign there, it says Manitoba Government Telephones. And that was the name of MTS before it was MTS. In fact, when it was first founded in 1908, up till 1933, it was known as Manitoba Government Telephone. So this building, although I don't know its exact age yet, it's obviously pre-1933 because it has the old name of the utility. And speaking of utilities, another building that my wife and I saw on our walks in St. Boniface was this building. And, I again looked at it and went, that's some kind of utility. I don't know what. If you can see in the background, there is a power transmission line right behind it. And so my thinking was, maybe there's some kind of electrical connection to it. And did some research, and yes, indeed, it was a substation for the Winnipeg Electric Company that provided power to this part of the city. Eventually, in the 1950s, this company, the Winnipeg Electric Company, was taken over by what is today Manitoba Hydro. Now, the building itself hasn't been used for electrical purposes for a long, long time. And there's actually been a whole host of different businesses in there that are occupying even now today. But it is originally, it's a power substation. And I nailed it with my guess when I was out walking in the field. Another kind of a sort of industrial building that fascinates me is this one. We were walking in Fort Garry, and the area just west of Pembina Highway, just north of Bishop Grandin Boulevard, there is the remains of the Manitoba Sugar Plant. Of course, it was built in the 1940s, back when the Second World War was raging. They were worried that if the war got any wider spread, that it might jeopardize the sugar supply from some of the tropical countries from which Manitoba was getting its sugar. So they developed a sugar industry that used sugar beets that were grown in much of the Red River Valley, in fact, much of southern Manitoba. There were farmers all over Manitoba growing sugar beets that were processed into into white sugar here at this plant. It was closed in 1997, so it's been empty basically. Well, I don't know if it's been empty actually. It has been closed since 1997, but I keep hearing rumors that tell me that there's still the sugar making equipment inside. And I would love to get inside that building. I've never managed to do it. I don't know how I would do it, but I sure would like to see if the original sugar making equipment is still there after, basically almost 25 years. So that's an interesting sort of abandoned building in Fort Garry. This building, you can tell from its tower, is an old fire hall. And there are former fire halls in various places around Winnipeg. They've been turned into other things. There's one in Wolseley, for example, that's been turned into someone's home. There's ones that have been turned into daycares, and there's various other things. This one up just off of Burroughs is a Buddhist temple. And I don't think it's in use right now, as many places of religious observances are closed to the public. But it's a nice old reminder of the fire history. In fact, this one, which was built in 1910, was one of the first two fire halls in the north end of Winnipeg, and it's the only one left. The other one that was built at the same time in 1910 has been demolished, and so it's the last one left. It's a nice reminder of that early firefighting history. A little further north, you get to Burroughs, and you see these para buildings. And of course, the one on the left, I think you can pretty easily tell was a church. In fact, it was something called the Robertson Memorial Presbyterian Church. That's the church on the left. It was built in 1911. It is still a church today, although it's being occupied by a different denomination than the Presbyterians. On the right, the building to the right of it was built at the same time. It was built in 1911 as well. And for the longest time, my wife and I were convinced that it was an old school. It looked like a school. It looked like a lot of the two-story brick schools that I've seen all over rural Manitoba. And that's what I thought it was. I did some research on it. It turns out it was called the Robertson Memorial Institute. And it was used for educational and recreational activities by the church's parishioners, particularly for youth programs. And of course, because it was right across the street from the church, it was very convenient. It was later used by the Winnipeg School Division. It was used by several urban indigenous organizations. And in fact, the local Buddhists also used it for a while as their temple. Today, my research indicates that it is a 16-bed safe house for youth that were living on the streets. It's a way to get them off the street and hopefully on a better life trajectory. So that's kind of interesting that I didn't know what this building was until I did a little bit of research. There's nothing on the exterior that would indicate what it is being used for today. Other buildings, well, corner stores. There's numerous ones around the city, and you can usually tell when a building used to be a corner store because it quite literally has a door at the corner. I don't know what there is about that, what the significance of that is, but it was always right at the corner. And for example, if you walk around in the northern part of the city, any part of the North End, Point Douglas, for example, there are scads of former corner stores, sometimes even just on adjacent corners. Like on one street corner, there might be two corner stores, almost like, you could choose between one or the other. And so I'll just show you a few corner stores that I saw. This one's on Manitoba Avenue. It was built in 1907. This one is on Aberdeen, not far away, built in 1911. A little newer corner store. This one is from 1926. You'll notice all of them have that corner door. But then there's other ones. So for example, we found this one, and it's on Luxton Avenue. You can see that sign at the top on the front. It says M. Kaufman. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Wonder what that means. So I did a little bit of research and found out it also was a grocery store. Now, I don't know, looking at the front of it, I suspect the facade has been rearranged. I have a feeling that it might have had a door on the middle between those two windows, and that door has been simply closed over in preference to the door on the side that we see here today. It's no longer a grocery store. It's actually a person's home, or at least it looked like it had been a home. Maybe it was something more recently than that, but whatever it was closed because you can see the sign is upside down and backwards, so not a functional facility. But in fact, it was built in 1914 by a gentleman named Max Kaufman, hence M. Kaufman, and it was a grocery store. Not only did he have a grocery store in front, he had his home in the back. So those two windows you can see in the back are presumably windows into his residence. It's a nice little grocery store in the North End. Or this building, this one fascinated me. If you look really closely at this building, this is over on St. Joseph Street in St. Boniface. You can see on the chimney, if you look up towards the top of the chimney, you can just make out a letter K, the letter K. And the reason for that is that it's the former Keywell Brewery. It was one of the first post-prohibition breweries. You know, after prohibition was relinquished, they built this brewery in late 1924. It was opening by mid 1925 with an annual output of some 30,000 barrels of beer. 30,000 barrels of beer sounds like an awful lot, especially when you haven't been allowed to drink beer. I imagine it was a pretty popular place in the aftermath of prohibition. It's one of the last surviving brewery buildings in Winnipeg. Of course, there are lots of breweries today, you know, small microbreweries, but most of them occupy either new buildings or in repurposed buildings that were older. This is the only sort of originally purpose-built breweries. It's not a brewery anymore. It's actually occupied by several small businesses. And then we have this building. This is the view that I first got when I was walking along the Assiniboine River, walking west of Winnipeg. We're just a little bit west of the Perimeter Highway. And I saw this little building through the trees and I was intrigued. So I had to go closer. So we climbed up the bank and walked a little closer. And this is what the building looks like close up. It's a fox tower. A fox tower. And you probably have never seen one. In my travels around the province, I have found only 4 other fox towers. And in fact, I would have never found this one if it weren't for the fact that I was walking along the Assiniboine. I would have never seen it driving along the highway. It just wasn't conspicuous to that degree. The idea was that originally when this building was built, and I don't know yet when it was built, there would have been all kinds of pens, holding pens for wild fox around it. And the farmer who was doing breeding, breeding a male and a female fox, would go up on the tower to the top with his binoculars and would keep tabs on things to see when breeding occurred so that he could move the male fox to another pen. And this industry, of course, raised fox for their fur so that they could make, among other things, fur coats. The industry was a large one in Manitoba until it basically collapsed in sort of people have different attitudes today, of course, about fur and especially wild fur. And so the industry, what fur is left is usually supplied with domestic fur sources today. And so as far as I know, there aren't any active fox farms in Manitoba. But this little remnant of that era from Manitoba's past is still there. Just to prove to you that I'm not just interested in the long distant history of Manitoba, here's a more recent photo that I took walking around Winnipeg. This is actually on Portage Avenue, right next to Moray. You can probably recognize the building. Some of you may have even been in this building. It's a former Robin's Donuts. And if you listen to my CBC program, you may remember that this past weekend, I talked about donut making in Manitoba and the fact that at one time in the 1990s, Robin's was the king of donuts in Manitoba, at least in Winnipeg. The majority of donut shops were run by Robin's. Now, for whatever reason, Robin's doesn't seem to be quite as dominant anymore. It seems that the dominant position has been taken over by Tim Hortons, and they've changed their attitudes about donuts, it seems. Maybe there's just an attitude that people think donuts aren't that healthy for you, and so they've kind of moved away from a lot of this. So, in fact, Robin's Donuts isn't called Robin's Donuts anymore. If you look at the signs on the remaining Robin's stores, they're just called Robin's. No donuts, I think, because they serve a variety of options, not just, the sugary donuts. But this building, I really don't know what's in store for it. This is a picture looking in the window, and you can see that it's basically been gutted to the 4 walls. There's nothing inside it. It was used during the last civic election. One of the candidates for city council used this as his election headquarters, but I don't know. It seemed to me either they're preparing it to be reused for something else, or maybe they're planning to demolish it. I don't know. But, demolition is something that, is really a theme in what I've been seeing in these walks. So we see, for example, the Gordon House on Wellington Crescent. a magnificent house dating back to 1909. And of course, many of you will know that it suffered a rather ignominious end at the hands of a series of earth movers in November of last fall. One of my friends, George Penner, who took this photo, happened to be there the day that they were tearing it down. In fact, not even the day, in the hours that they tore it down. Literally, by cover of semi-darkness, they went in and tore it all down. The result was that when my wife and I were out walking a few days later, this is what we saw. Nothing. There is a big empty lot, and there are plans now to build a multifamily residence on the site. Too bad, a little bit of heritage loss there. Likewise, this building, we saw this one not long ago along Grosvenor, and if you look closely, the roof looks to be falling into the building. It is really in sad shape. Seems to me that this is probably also going to suffer a rather drastic end in the near future. Or we talk demolition, of course, there is Kapyong Barracks. I used to drive by Kapyong all the time, and I luckily had an opportunity in mid-2018 to walk the grounds of Kapyong. I was accompanied by a military personnel, and just to make sure I didn't go run amok or anything. And I got pictures of the exteriors of all the buildings. Well, when my wife and I walked again around the site, it is flattened. There is nothing left. There's only one small building that wasn't demolished, and of course, that's because it doesn't belong to the Department of National Defense. It actually belongs to Manitoba Hydro, and so therefore it was spared from being demolished. Everything else is gone, and of course, we are going to be seeing, hopefully in the next year or two, something new arising on the spot. Now, I don't know how much you're following recent news. I was looking this morning in the newspaper, and I was hearing about some development plans, and they pertain to a site in Charleswood. So if any of you are familiar, if you drive along Roblin Boulevard, you can see the old Oddfellows home. Used to be a seniors facility. I think it still used for seniors. Built in 1922-23. It was built and intended to be used not just by seniors, but also by orphan children. And that's why if you look at the back of the building, that's what this picture shows. The door, if you look really closely, you'll see it says boys over the door. And on the other side of the building, there is a corresponding door that's labeled girls. The idea being is that boys and girls would go in separate entrances. Well, if you looked in the news this morning, you may have seen that there is a possibility that they intend to build a 10-story residential building on the grounds where this building stands. And this picture looks at the site where they probably intend to do that. Now, I have to wonder if this means then the end of the old Oddfellows home. And there are people who are not terribly excited about this whole prospect of having a 10-story building right there in Charleswood, because there really aren't very many tall buildings in Charleswood, especially not 10 stories. So the locals are not terribly happy about the whole thing. So remains to be seen what's going to happen to the old Oddfellows Hall. But when we were walking along the Seine River, we saw a whole bunch of what are called shards. And shards are basically the remains of buildings. As you can see here, they're partly covered with snow, but they're very clearly the remains of some sort of fancy building. And I contacted my a fellow I know in the city government and asked if he knew what building this might have been. And he didn't. He said that they were using all sorts of materials for erosion control along the banks of the Seine, and that's probably what this was. It was just used for erosion control. Moving into Crescentwood, we see this little building. It is the remains of a coach house. Back in the days when rich people had the ability to hire somebody to drive them around, either to drive their horse-drawn wagon or their automobile, and then instead of living somewhere else, the coachman would live in the garage. And so here we have a nice 2-story building. There's the garage on the lower level, and there's a little apartment on the upper level that would have been used by the coachman. This one was built in 1913, and it's still being used as an apartment. Actually, I talked to a guy that lived in it up until about a year ago, and he was telling me about what it was like to live in the little coach house. And in this part of Winnipeg, there are piles of coach houses. One day, my wife and I went around trying to see how many coach houses we could find in the course of a day's walk, and I forget the total. It was a fairly significant one. So I'll just jump through a few of the examples that we saw. Here's another one of the coach houses. This one is, as far as we know, from the 1890s, probably one of the oldest coach houses. It's been thoroughly remodeled and actually modernized, and it's still actually possibly used as a residence on the top floor. I actually know the person who owns this one, and she was telling me that it isn't actually used on a regular basis, but occasionally it is. Or this one, you'll notice it has a little door on the second level, presumably so that they could, in theory, bring up supplies. Maybe they would bring up hay if they needed to keep hay for horses. They would have a little door to bring the hay up and to store it in the upper loft above the area where the horses would be. In fact, this is a fairly common theme in the coach houses. Here you can see another one. In fact, this door on the second level, you can see there's that little nub sticking out above the door. That's probably where they would have had a block and tackle so that they could raise heavy things up and bring them in through that door. So whether that was hay or whether it was other stuff, I don't know. But clearly they were using the upper level of this building, which is today, I think, just a garage, using it for something in addition. Or this example, again, you notice that little protruding piece where they would have had a block and tackle up to those doors. But what is arguably the most sophisticated coach house that we saw in our travels was this one. This one is in Armstrong's Point, not far from the Maryland Bridge. And it shows the coach house attached to what's called the Gordon House, or sometimes called Ralph Connor House, which is the headquarters of the University Women's Club. A spectacular home, just a beautiful house inside. And what is not so well known is that it has a nice coach house in the backyard. Quite an elaborate one, in fact, 1913, dating to the time when the house itself was built. Now, what's unusual about this coach house, it's not used anymore. We talked to somebody at the site when we were going by a few weeks back, and they said, no, it's not used for anything but just storage. Storage being the euphemism for just putting crap that you don't want anymore in there. But when we were walking along the river, this is what we saw from the river. This is a view from the river. In this case, the apartment for the coachman wasn't above the area where the horses or the car would be. In this case, the coachman's apartment was below it. And in other words, it kind of descends along the riverbank down to the river. And I have to think that during high flood years, the poor coachman would have got flooded out just because his apartment would have been fairly low lying. So that's kind of interesting. And again, something I would have never seen had I not been walking along the rivers. Here's another little building in St. Boniface. It indulges my particular fetish for concrete block buildings made with concrete blocks. It was a technology that was used for about 10 years, from about 1904 to about 1914. Why the technology ended, I don't know, but almost all of the buildings that I have found, and I found numerous concrete block buildings, both here in Winnipeg and around rural Manitoba, and they all date to this time period. This particular example on Dollard Boulevard was built in 1911, so it fits nicely into that time frame. I don't know much more about the house itself. I'm curious to know who the contractor would have been, to see if the same contractor was building other concrete block houses around Winnipeg. But I just, at this point, don't yet know. But I was excited to see this particular example. Here's another thing that I had never seen until I started walking around the city. I knew it existed. I had never seen it myself. It's the surge tank for the Shoal Lake Aqueduct that brings us water from Shoal Lake. And it's still active. It's used still every single day to compensate for the pressure of the water in the aqueduct. And water rises and falls in this big tank, built in 1919. So a very real part of our water supply system here in Winnipeg. But the last picture I'm going to show you is perhaps one of the most enigmatic. Somebody contacted me not long ago and asked me what I knew about this building. So my wife and I made an express trip a couple of weeks ago over to have a look at it. It's at 496 and a half Tlingit over in St. Boniface. And to look at it, I could not tell you what it had been in the past. I did some research. I know that it was built in 1913. It's obviously, as you can see here, it's 2 stories made of brick. It's pretty solid. But when I did some research on it, all I could determine is that it was a 2-apartment block, Basically, it's been modified a little bit. There used to be 2 doors, on the main level, and then the door would have led into a part on the main floor, and then there would have been stairs up to the second floor. So each apartment would have been 2-story. But why would somebody build a 2-story, 2-apartment a block, and not build it bigger? And why they put it there? It's actually not on the street. It's actually behind 496 Blingett. Why somebody built it in their backyard, I do not know. But it's a mystery, and it's a mystery I hope someday to be able to solve. Well, I hope that in the process of showing you the various places my wife and I have walked, I maybe have made you willing to get out and walk. And if I can assist in any way, I will help you to do so. Maybe I've inspired you with some of the pictures I've shown you today, but I also want to refer you to a webpage of the Manitoba Historical Society where there is an interactive map of historic sites. Here's the address of it here. You can put this into your web browser on your desktop computer or your laptop or your tablet or even your smartphone, and it actually configures itself depending on what kind of device you're using. So on a smartphone, for example, the screen is much more compact, but all the same information is there, and you can zoom in on any particular part of the province. You can have it show you specific things. So for example, here is the zoomed in area of Armstrong's Point, and it's showing me buildings along Westgate. What I've done is I've put in a query in the right-hand side of the search interface, and I've asked it to show me buildings in Armstrong's Point on Westgate. And you can drill down even more specifically than that. You can put in the year of construction, you can put in the name of the architect, you can put in the type of building material, and you can find a lot of things. So for instance, if I click on one of those symbols, those little red symbols on that map, it will bring up a page of information. So for example, at 184 Westgate is the former Spears House that was owned by a baker, a fellow who owned a big bakery called James Marnie Spears. And there's some information like a biography of Mr. Spears. There's a photo and stuff. You know, you can find all sorts of information. So I'm hopeful that you will use this and other resources to get out and walk, get out and see, Manitoba, see Winnipeg. And, one of the things that has really inspired me is in the process of doing the radio program that I do with CBC, to see so much of Manitoba. And it has led me in so many directions that I would never have anticipated when I first started doing this. And it has had unintended consequences. So, for example, I've now published 2 books as a result of the work that I do for the Manitoba Historical Society, as well as for the CBC. The first one came out in 2016 entitled Abandoned Manitoba. And then 2 years later, in 2018, the sequel, More Abandoned Manitoba. And if any of you are interested, I am working on another sequel. It will probably not be published until 2022, another year at least. And I'm still working on the title. It will not be More Abandoned Manitoba. The working title for the next sequel will be On the Road to Abandoned Manitoba. And the rationale for that is that there are all kinds of things you can see when you're out and driving. So much as I've enjoyed walking, I also enjoy driving and seeing the things you can see around the province. So I will end my presentation with this photo. Here I am standing on top of what looks like a giant tree stump. No, it's not one of those giant cottonwoods that I was showing you before. This one is actually made out of concrete. So it's entirely artificial. It's not a real tree stump at all. I'm out in the sandy lands, and there's a story about it, but I'll leave you to puzzle that one yourself. I will simply say that if you wish to contact me, you're more than welcome to do so. I'm giving you my email address here, gordon@mhs.mb.ca. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to try to answer them. So I would simply say thank you very much. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to speak with you again at some point in the future. Thank you.